Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. This video is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. The sociological trends, historical data, and case studies discussed do not constitute legal, psychological, or financial advice. Family law, custody arrangements, and mental health issues are deeply personal and vary significantly by jurisdiction and individual circumstance. We strongly urge viewers to conduct their own due diligence and consult with qualified professionals, such as attorneys or licensed therapists, before making any decisions regarding their domestic or legal situations. In the United States, a father is often described as the backbone of the traditional nuclear family, yet every 36 seconds, a divorce occurs, and a new demographic is born into a sociological vacuum. We are talking about the American divorced father, a figure often relegated to the periphery of the family unit, transformed by legal and social structures from a primary protector into what sociologists call a secondary parent or a visitor. There is a silent crisis unfolding in the suburbs and cities of this country, one where millions of men are navigating a landscape that was never designed for their emotional or social survival. Statistically, children in father-absent homes are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and twice as likely to drop out of school, but the sociological inquiry rarely asks, what is happening to the men themselves? Why does the American system seem to produce a specific type of isolation for the paternal figure post-dissolution? This is not just a story of heartbreak. It is a deep dive into the invisible architecture of American law, gender expectations, and the shifting definition of masculinity in the 21st century. This video serves as a masterclass to help you understand the structural forces at play, the historical trends that have led us here, and the potential outcomes for those navigating this complex social transition. We are going to dismantle the myths and look at the raw data of the fatherhood experience in America today. To understand the divorced father in 2026, we must first look at the historical transition of the American family. For the better part of the 20th century, the American household operated under the breadwinner homemaker model. In this configuration, a father's value was almost exclusively tied to his economic output. Sociologists identify this as the provider role, where masculinity was validated through the acquisition of resources and the protection of the domestic sphere. However, as no-fault divorce laws swept through the United States in the 1970s, starting with California, the legal framework for ending a marriage shifted faster than the social framework for fatherhood could keep up. We saw a massive rise in the matrifocal household, where the mother became the central node of the family and the father was pushed to the exterior. This shift created a sociological phenomenon known as the disappearing father, not always because of a lack of will, but because of a lack of a defined role once the marriage contract was severed. The primary problem we are addressing today is the identity liquidation that occurs when a man exits the marital home. In many American subcultures, a man's identity is a composite of his professional title and his status as a husband and father. When the latter two are stripped away or significantly altered, many men experience what is known as anomic suicide risk or severe social alienation. By examining case studies of custody battles and the evolution of the tender years doctrine, which historically presumed that mothers were the only fit caregivers for young children, we can see how the modern divorced dad is often fighting against a century of momentum. This deep dive will provide you with the sociological lens necessary to view divorce not just as a personal failure, but as a systemic event. We will explore how the American legal system's pursuit of the best interests of the child often inadvertently creates a winner-take-all dynamic that leaves fathers in a state of perpetual transition, living out of suitcases every other weekend and struggling to maintain a sense of authority and connection with their offspring. Consider the data regarding the standard of living post-divorce. Historical trends often highlight that women suffer a more significant immediate drop in household income, which is a critical economic reality. However, sociological research also reveals a hidden metric: the loss of social capital for men. In the United States, women are typically the social architects of the family. They maintain the calendars, the relationships with extended family, and the connections with the school community. When a divorce occurs, the father often loses not just his wife, but his entire social infrastructure. He finds himself in a one-bedroom apartment, disconnected from the neighborhood network he helped fund, and struggling to recreate a domestic environment that feels legitimate to his children. This is the visitor trap, a sociological state where the father feels like a guest in his children's lives rather than a pillar. Step by step, we must analyze how the court system's default settings have shaped this experience. Until recently, the joint custody model was the exception rather than the rule. The The default was the primary-secondary split, which effectively created a hierarchy of parenting. This hierarchy reinforces the sociological trope of the bumbling or peripheral dad, a theme we see reflected in American media and advertising. When a man is told by the state that he is a 20% parent, he often begins to internalize that percentage. We see this play out in the economics of child support, where the relationship is frequently reduced to a monthly transaction. This commodification of fatherhood is a central theme in our deep dive, as it changes the nature of the bond from one of shared life to one of financial obligation, which can lead to resentment, withdrawal, and the eventual fracturing of the paternal bond. Furthermore, we must look at the psychological toll of the empty chair. In many American households, the father's presence is felt through his labor and his physical occupancy of the space. When he is removed, the sociological impact on the remaining unit is well documented, but the impact on the man's psyche is often ignored. Men in the United States are conditioned to externalize their value. Without the feedback loop of a daily family life, many divorced fathers fall into a cycle of overwork or total withdrawal. They become what sociologists call the peripheral patriarch, someone who is respected from a distance, but rarely integrated into the daily emotional fabric of the family. This leads to a unique form of American loneliness, one that is exacerbated by a culture that often views a single, middle-aged man with suspicion or pity. This video will guide you through the transition from the traditional provider to the modern nurturant father, a role that many divorced dads are now fighting to inhabit. We will look at how the rise of shared parenting movements across various U.S. states is attempting to recalibrate the sociological scales. This is a journey through the evolution of the American male, moving from a position of systemic dominance within the nuclear family to a position of precarious navigation in a post-nuclear world. By the end of this deep dive, you will understand why the current state of divorced fatherhood in America is one of the most significant, yet overlooked, sociological shifts of our time. We are going to look at the historical trends, the potential outcomes for families who choose different paths, and the deep-seated cultural reasons why being a divorced dad in America feels like walking a tightrope without a net. This is about more than just custody schedules. It is about the very definition of what it means to be a man and a parent in a society that is still deciding where you fit in. The legal landscape of 2026 is a reflection of over a century of oscillating philosophies regarding who belongs in the home and who belongs in the workforce. To understand the sociology of the divorced father, we must look at the legal skeleton that holds up his social reality. Historically, under English common law, which influenced early American law, the father was the absolute head of the household, a concept known as the paterfamilias. In that era, the father actually held the primary right to custody because children were viewed as an economic asset and a responsibility of the estate. However, as the Industrial Revolution pulled men out of the home and into factories, a seismic shift occurred. This gave birth to the tender years doctrine in the mid-19th century. This legal principle held that during a child's early years, specifically those under the age of 7, the mother was uniquely and naturally suited to provide the necessary care. Sociologically, this was the moment the father was officially codified as the secondary caregiver. Imagine if we looked at the life of David, a 38-year-old project manager in Charlotte, North Carolina, in 2026. David represents millions of American men caught in the transition between the old breadwinner model and the new expectation of the involved father. When David's marriage dissolved last year, he entered a system that, while claiming to be gender neutral, still carries the heavy baggage of the tender years doctrine. The modern legal standard used in all 50 states is the best interests of the child. On the surface, this sounds irreproachable. Who wouldn't want what is best for a child? But sociologically, this standard is what researchers call a vague standard, meaning it allows for the personal biases of judges and evaluators to fill in the blanks. Because David moved into a smaller apartment to ensure his ex-wife and children could stay in the family home for stability, a judge might view his new environment as less stable, inadvertently penalizing him for his own sacrifice. Step by step, the institutionalization of the divorced father begins with the temporary order. This is a critical sociological juncture. Within weeks of a filing, a court often issues a temporary ruling that establishes a status quo. If David is granted the standard possession order, which in many states still defaults to the first, third, and fifth weekends of the month, he is immediately transformed from a full-time parent into a visitor. This visitor status has profound psychological implications. It creates a dynamic where the father must pack a life into 48 hours every 2 weeks. Sociologists refer to this as the Disneyland dad phenomenon. Because David feels the pressure of his limited time, he is less likely to engage in the mundane, essential tasks of parenting like homework, discipline, or chores. Instead, he feels compelled to provide high-stimulation entertainment to ensure his children still enjoy being with him. This effectively stunts the development of a deep, authentic emotional bond, replacing it with a curated, event-based relationship. We must also examine the historical trends of Title 4D of the Social Security Act. This is the federal program that provides funding to states to help manage child support collection. While intended to ensure children are provided for, it has created a massive administrative bureaucracy that views the father primarily as a financial resource. In 2026, the state-run child support systems operate with a high degree of automation. For a man like David, his fatherhood is now quantified by a mathematical formula. If he loses his job or faces a medical emergency, the arrears can pile up with interest, leading to the potential outcome of license suspension or even incarceration in extreme cases. This creates a debtor-creditor relationship between the parents, which sociologists have found is one of the leading causes of high-conflict post-divorce dynamics. When the state treats the father as an ATM, it reinforces the social narrative that his physical and emotional presence is secondary to his financial output. Case studies from the American Psychological Association suggest that when fathers are relegated to this secondary role, they often experience identity liquidation. Imagine if you spent 10 years building a life where your primary purpose was to provide and protect a specific group of people, and suddenly you are told you can only do that 4 days a month. This leads to a state of anomie, a sociological term for a breakdown of social bonds between an individual and their community. David finds that his social circle, which was largely comprised of other married couples, begins to evaporate. In America, social life is often organized around the nuclear family unit. Once that unit is fractured, the divorced father often finds himself without a tribe. He is not a bachelor, yet he is no longer a husband. He is a parent, but he has no children in his home on a Tuesday night. This isolation is a silent epidemic among American men. Furthermore, we need to analyze the architecture of the visit. Look at the physical space a divorced father inhabits. In 2026, the rising cost of urban housing means many divorced fathers are living in transitional spaces. The spare bedroom in a father's apartment is often a ghost room, filled with toys that aren't played with for 25 days a month. This physical environment serves as a constant sociological reminder of his peripheral status. This is in stark contrast to the custodial home, which remains the hub of the child's life. This disparity creates a geographical and emotional distance that is difficult to bridge. Potential outcomes for children in these situations often include a feeling of living two separate lives, where the father's house is a vacation spot and the mother's house is reality. The data shows a shifting trend, however. As of 2026, several U.S. states have moved toward a rebuttable presumption of equal shared parenting. This is a massive sociological shift that challenges the 150-year-old preference for maternal custody. In states like Kentucky and Arizona, the law now assumes that a 50-50 split is in the child's best interest unless proven otherwise. For fathers in these states, the sociology of their experience is radically different. They remain integrated into the daily routine of school lunches, doctor's appointments, and Tuesday night tantrums. This continuity prevents the Disneyland dad trap and allows for the maintenance of a stable, authoritative parental identity. However, in states that have not adopted these presumptions, the fight for equal time remains a primary source of litigation and emotional exhaustion. Consider the financial impact of litigation as a sociological barrier. The average contested divorce in the United States can cost tens of thousands of dollars. For a middle-class father, this often means depleting retirement accounts or taking on significant debt. This creates a class-based disparity in fatherhood. Wealthier men can afford the legal representation and psychological experts needed to argue for more time, while lower-income men are often forced to accept whatever the default schedule provides. This effectively means that in many parts of America, the right to be an involved father is becoming a luxury good. The sociological study of divorced dads is also the study of modern masculinity. We are seeing a generation of men who were raised to be more emotionally expressive than their own fathers, yet they are navigating a legal system designed by a previous generation that valued the silent provider. This creates a cognitive dissonance. David wants to be the man who talks to his daughter about her day, but the system often only cares if David is the man who sent the check on the first of the month. This tension is at the heart of the modern fatherhood crisis. It is a struggle for legitimacy in a world that is still comfortable viewing the father as the optional parent. As we continue this deep dive, we have to ask, what happens to the psyche of a man who feels he has been replaced? What occurs when the social institutions he trusted, the court, the community, the family, seem to turn against his very presence in his children's lives? We are moving from the legal framework into the dark territory of parental alienation and the social stigma of the weekend warrior. But before we get there, we need to look at the specific moment the door closes on that first weekend alone. What does the data say about the health and longevity of men who lose their primary family connection? And why are we seeing a surge in support groups for men who feel like they have become ghosts in their own lives? The answer lies in the way American society defines a successful man, and the way that definition collapses the moment the divorce decree is signed. To understand why the collapse of the marital identity is so devastating for the American father, we have to look at the physiological and sociological data regarding male longevity and health post-divorce. In 2026, the data remains startling. Divorced men in the United States have a mortality rate nearly 250% higher than their married counterparts. This is not a coincidence. It is a direct consequence of what sociologists call the loss of the social monitor. In a traditional marital structure, the spouse often acts as the primary health advocate, noticing the early signs of hypertension, encouraging better dietary habits, and managing the stress of the household. When that monitor is removed, the divorced father often falls into a state of self-neglect that is both systemic and psychological. Imagine Marcus, a 42-year-old software engineer in Austin, Texas. Before his divorce in 2025, Marcus was the quintessential suburban dad. His identity was reinforced daily by the tasks he performed: fixing the bike in the garage, attending parent-teacher conferences, and maintaining a social circle that revolved entirely around his children's soccer team. The moment the divorce was finalized, Marcus underwent what sociologists term role exit. He did not just lose a wife, he lost the script for his life. In the United States, we do not have a robust social script for the middle-aged single father that does not involve either a search for a new partner or a retreat into isolation. For Marcus, the health implications began almost immediately. Without the routine of family meals, he shifted toward high-sodium, processed convenience foods, a common trend in case studies of recently separated men. His cortisol levels, the body's primary stress hormone, remained chronically elevated due to the uncertainty of his new living situation and the looming financial pressure of maintaining two households. This chronic stress is a known precursor to cardiovascular disease. Historical trends show that men are less likely to seek preventative medical care when they are not part of a stable family unit. Marcus represents the millions of men who become invisible to the healthcare system because they no longer have the social infrastructure to prioritize their own well-being. Step by step, the sociological isolation of the divorced dad occurs through a process of social network pruning. In the United States, social capital is often held jointly in a marriage. When the split happens, the friends who were once a support system often feel forced to choose sides, or more commonly, they drift away because the divorced father no longer fits into the couple-centric activities of the suburban middle class. Marcus finds that invitations to weekend barbecues or holiday parties begin to vanish. He is now a social outlier. This leads to the suspect status, a phenomenon where a single man in a neighborhood dominated by families is viewed with a subtle, often unconscious, level of suspicion. If Marcus goes to the park to watch his children on his designated weekend, he feels the weight of the gaze of other parents who see him as a visitor rather than a resident. This suspicion is a form of social stigma that further drives the divorced father into the shadows. In many American subcultures, a man's failure to keep his family together is viewed as a fundamental failure of leadership. This internalized shame prevents many men from reaching out for help. They fall into the stoic trap, believing that their only option is to grind through the pain in silence. Potential outcomes for men in this state include a significant increase in substance abuse as a form of self-medication. Case studies from 2024 and 2025 show a sharp rise in alcohol-related health issues among divorced men between the ages of 35 and 55. It is not just about the loss of the relationship, it is about the loss of the purpose that the relationship provided. We must also consider the impact of the ghost home. This is the living space inhabited by the divorced father that is perpetually prepared for children who are rarely there. For Marcus, his two-bedroom apartment is a physical manifestation of his fragmented life. One room is a shrine to his children, filled with toys and clothes that stay exactly where they were left 2 weeks ago. This environment creates a psychological state of suspended animation. He is not fully moving on to a new life, nor is he able to fully inhabit his old one. The sociology of the home suggests that our physical surroundings anchor our sense of self. When those surroundings are vacant 80% of the time, the sense of self begins to erode. Data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and independent sociological surveys in 2026 highlight a trend known as the productivity dip. Divorced fathers often experience a decline in professional performance in the first 24 months following a separation. This is frequently misinterpreted as a lack of ambition, but from a sociological perspective, it is a symptom of cognitive load. The man is navigating a legal system, a housing crisis, and a social identity crisis all at once. The mental energy required to maintain the facade of the successful professional, while his private world has collapsed, is immense. This is why the American workplace is becoming a new frontier for male-focused support systems, though historical trends suggest that men are still hesitant to utilize these resources for fear of appearing weak. Another critical factor is the intergenerational transmission of fatherhood. Many of today's divorced dads were raised by the silent generation or early boomers who modeled a version of fatherhood that was more distant. These modern men want to be different. They want to be the emotionally available fathers we see in modern media. However, when the system forces them into a secondary role, they face a double bind. They are criticized if they are not involved, yet the structural barriers we discussed earlier, legal, financial, and geographical, make that involvement incredibly difficult to sustain. This leads to what is known as paternal burnout, where the father eventually gives up the fight for more time because the emotional and financial cost is simply too high. But what happens when the father tries to move forward? What happens when a new person enters the equation? In the next part of our deep dive, we are going to explore one of the most volatile sociological landscapes in the American family: the introduction of the step-parent and the phenomenon of parental alienation. We will look at how the presence of a new partner can either be a bridge to a new life or a catalyst for total relational collapse. We will examine the data on how children perceive these new figures and the potential outcomes for the biological father's authority when he is no longer the only man in the picture. The stakes are about to get much higher as we look at the psychological warfare that can erupt when the boundaries of the post-divorce family are tested. How does a man maintain his status as a father when his children start calling someone else dad? And why does the American legal system often struggle to protect the paternal bond during these transitions? The answers will reveal even more about the hidden architecture of the American family. The entry of a new romantic partner into the post-divorce landscape represents one of the most volatile sociological shifts a father can experience. In the United States, we are seeing the rise of the binuclear family, a term coined to describe a family system spread across two households. However, the integration of a step-parent often triggers what sociologists call the replacement anxiety. To understand this, let us look at the case of Robert, a 45-year-old middle manager in Columbus, Ohio. In 2026, Robert is 2 years post-divorce. His ex-wife, Sarah, has recently moved in with a new partner, Mark. For Robert, Mark is not just a new person in Sarah's life. He is a potential social father who occupies the physical space Robert once held. Historical trends suggest that the introduction of a stepfather can lead to a significant reconfiguration of the biological father's authority. This is often driven by a phenomenon known as maternal gatekeeping. Sociologically, gatekeeping refers to the collection of beliefs and behaviors that ultimately shape the level of involvement a father has with his children. It exists on a spectrum from facilitative, where the mother encourages the paternal bond, to restrictive. In Robert's case, we see the emergence of restrictive gatekeeping. This does not always manifest as a blunt refusal of visitation. Instead, it is a step-by-step process of social displacement. The first step in this displacement often begins with information control. In 2026, the digital life of a child is managed through school portals, sports team apps, and medical records. If Sarah intentionally or unintentionally fails to list Robert as a primary contact or neglects to share login credentials, Robert is effectively blinded to the daily rhythms of his children's lives. He becomes dependent on Sarah for information, which shifts the power dynamic. When Mark, who is physically present in the home, begins attending the parent-teacher conferences that Robert was never notified about, the sociological replacement is well underway. The second step involves scheduling sabotage. Imagine if Robert's designated weekend is suddenly interrupted by a last-minute soccer tournament or a birthday party for one of Mark's relatives. If the mother frames these events as something the children really want to do, the father is placed in a sociological double bind. If he insists on his court-ordered time, he is framed as the rigid, selfish parent who is depriving the children of fun. If he yields, he loses the precious little time he has to maintain his bond. Over time, these small concessions erode the father's status from a central parent to a secondary, optional figure. This leads us into the highly controversial territory of parental alienation. While the term is often debated in legal circles, sociologists observe it as a spectrum of alienating behaviors. It is a form of psychological warfare where one parent undermines the child's relationship with the other. In 2026, data suggests that high-conflict custody cases often feature subtle forms of alienation that are difficult for courts to quantify. It starts with the language used in the custodial home. If a child consistently hears their father referred to as a guest, or as someone who is too busy for them, they begin to internalize a narrative of paternal abandonment. Potential outcomes for children caught in this loyalty conflict are severe. Sociologists identify a state called the split loyalty bind, where the child feels that loving one parent is a betrayal of the other. For a father like Robert, seeing his children become distant or cold during handoffs is devastating. He may react by becoming overindulgent to win them back, or he may begin to withdraw to protect himself from the emotional pain of rejection. This withdrawal is exactly what the alienating parent often seeks, as it provides visual proof of the father's lack of commitment. The role of the step-parent in the United States is sociologically unique, because they hold significant social influence but almost no legal rights. Mark, in our case study, might be the one helping with homework, driving the children to practice, and sharing daily meals. He is performing the labor of fatherhood without the biological or legal title. This creates a friction point known as the social fatherhood paradox. In the eyes of the school and the community, Mark is the visible father. In the eyes of the law, he is a legal stranger. This creates a tension where the biological father, Robert, feels his identity is being commodified. He pays the child support that funds the life Mark is actively participating in. We must also analyze the financial dimension of this new family structure. Historical trends in the U.S. show that when a custodial mother remarries or cohabitates with a high-earning partner, the economic stability of the children's primary home often increases. While this is objectively good for the children, it can have a negative sociological impact on the biological father's self-worth. If Robert is struggling to pay child support and maintain a modest apartment, while Mark and Sarah live in a large suburban home with new cars and expensive vacations, Robert's perceived utility as a provider is diminished. In a society that still largely measures a man's value by his resource acquisition, this disparity can lead to profound feelings of inadequacy and depression. Case studies from 2024 and 2025 highlight how this economic gap is often weaponized in subtle ways. A child might return from the father's house and complain about the lack of amenities, which is then used by the custodial parent to suggest that the father's home is unsuitable or less desirable. This is part of the architecture of the Saturday handoff, a high-stakes sociological event where the two worlds of the child collide. The driveway of the custodial home becomes a border crossing, fraught with tension, unspoken accusations, and the heavy presence of the new partner standing in the background. Furthermore, we are seeing a trend in 2026 where digital surveillance is being integrated into these transitions. Many divorced parents now use court-mandated communication apps. While these tools are designed to reduce conflict by providing a documented trail of interaction, they also create a state of perpetual surveillance. Every message Robert sends can be scrutinized by Sarah and potentially by Mark. This lack of private, direct communication further complicates the father's ability to lead and parent with confidence. He is always performing for an audience that may be looking for reasons to further restrict his access. The psychological toll on the man in this position cannot be overstated. He is fighting a war on multiple fronts: against a legal system that defaults to a visitor schedule, against a social narrative that views him as replaceable, and against a financial reality that often leaves him depleted. This is why we see a surge in what is called the father absence cycle, where the obstacles to involvement become so high that the father eventually stops trying. This is not a lack of love, it is a systemic defeat. But what happens when the financial pressure becomes more than just a social embarrassment? What happens when the very act of being a father in America becomes a path to professional and financial ruin? In the next part, we are going to dive deep into the economics of divorce, the reality of the child support trap, and the shocking data on how the U.S. legal system handles the financial dissolution of the father. We will look at why some men are choosing to leave their careers entirely to avoid a system they believe is rigged against them. The financial architecture of the divorced dad is perhaps the most misunderstood part of this entire sociology, and the numbers we are about to reveal will change the way you look at the American family forever. The financial architecture of the American divorce is built upon a foundation of 19th century economic theory, applied to a 21st century reality. In 2026, the primary engine of this architecture is the child support system, a mechanism that, while intended to ensure the well-being of the child, often functions as a system of permanent financial subordination for the non-custodial father. To see this in action, we must look at James, a 41-year-old lead technician in Denver, Colorado. James earned $95,000 a year before his divorce. In the eyes of the Colorado court system, James is a high-earning professional. However, the sociological reality of James's post-divorce life tells a different story. Step by step, we must analyze the income shares model, which is the most common method for calculating support in the United States today. This model is based on the sociological assumption that children should receive the same proportion of parental income that they would have received if the parents lived together. The court takes James's gross income and his ex-wife's income, combines them, and then looks at a state-mandated table to determine the total cost of raising a child at that income level. In 2026, these tables are often criticized for failing to keep pace with the hyperinflation of housing and essential services. Because James is the non-custodial parent, the system assumes he has fewer day-to-day expenses for children, and thus a large portion of his take-home pay is diverted to the custodial household. However, the math rarely accounts for the reality of maintaining two households. Imagine if James wants to be an involved father. To do so, he cannot simply rent a room in a shared house. He must provide a home that a judge deems suitable for children. In a high-cost city like Denver in 2026, this means James is paying for a multi-bedroom apartment that sits empty for 26 days a month. Sociologists call this the duplication tax. James is paying for two of everything: 2 beds, 2 sets of clothes, 2 sets of toys, and 2 sets of utilities. When you combine his child support obligation, which is calculated based on his gross income before taxes, with his own rising rent, health insurance premiums for the children, and his own student loan debt, James is often left with what is known as subsistence-level residual income. He is a man earning nearly 6 figures who is living on the financial edge, often unable to afford a car repair or a medical emergency of his own. This brings us to the devastating legal concept of imputed income. This is a critical point in our masterclass because it highlights the rigidity of the American legal system. Imagine if James, overwhelmed by the stress of his divorce and the loss of daily contact with his children, wants to take a less demanding job. Perhaps he wants to move into a role with no overtime so he can actually be present during his limited visitation hours. In many American jurisdictions, the court will refuse to lower his support obligation. The legal theory is that James has a duty to earn at his maximum capacity. By choosing a lower-paying job, he is seen as voluntarily impoverishing himself to avoid support. The court will impute income to him, meaning they will bill him based on what he could be making, not what he is actually making. This creates a potential outcome where James is legally required to pay a percentage of money that does not exist in his bank account, leading to an ever-mounting mountain of debt. We must also look at the historical trends of Title 4D of the Social Security Act. This is the federal program that provides funding to states to help manage child support collection. While the intent was to prevent children from falling into poverty and relying on public assistance, it has created a massive administrative bureaucracy. In 2026, every state receives federal incentive payments for every dollar of child support they collect. This creates a sociological friction point. The system is incentivized to keep support orders high because higher orders mean more federal funding for the state's enforcement agencies. For a man like James, he is not just a father. He is a revenue stream for a multi-billion-dollar federal-state partnership. This explains why it is often so difficult and expensive to modify a support order, even when a man's financial circumstances have fundamentally changed. Consider the case study of the professional liquidation. In 2026, a contested divorce involving children in the United States often costs between $30,000 and $60,000 in legal fees. For James, this money did not come from a surplus. It came from his 401k and his home equity. He has effectively traded his entire life savings for the right to see his children 4 days a month. This financial trauma is a primary driver of the productivity dip we discussed earlier. When a man is working 60 hours a week but sees no improvement in his personal quality of life because the majority of his earnings are diverted to legal fees and support, his motivation to excel in the workplace begins to evaporate. This is the provider trap. He must work harder than ever to sustain a life he is no longer allowed to live. Furthermore, the American Tax Code in 2026 adds another layer of sociological disparity. In most cases, the custodial parent is the only one entitled to file as head of household and claim the child tax credit. This means James is paying a higher tax rate as a single filer, while simultaneously paying out a large portion of his income in child support. Historically, child support was not taxed as income to the recipient, nor was it deductible for the payer. This creates a situation where the father is taxed on money he never gets to touch. For a middle-class father, this tax burden can be the difference between financial stability and falling into the debt cycle. Step by step, this financial pressure leads to a state of social withdrawal. James can no longer afford the lifestyle he had when he was married. He cannot afford to go out with friends, he cannot afford to travel, and he certainly cannot afford to date. He becomes a prisoner of his own paycheck. This is the hidden sociology of the deadbeat dad myth. Data from 2024 and 2025 indicates that the vast majority of men who fall behind on child support are not doing so because they are unwilling to pay, but because they have suffered an economic collapse that the system refuses to recognize. When James falls behind, the system does not offer a social safety net. It offers punishment. The potential outcomes include the revocation of his driver's license, which in most parts of the U.S. makes it impossible for him to work, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of financial ruin. Case studies from rural and suburban America show that this cycle often leads to the total abandonment of the career. Some men, feeling that the system is rigged against their survival, choose to work under the table or leave the formal economy entirely. This is a massive loss of human capital for the United States, driven by a legal framework that treats the father as an economic commodity rather than a human being with his own needs for stability and growth. We are seeing a generation of men who feel that the social contract has been broken. They were told to work hard, provide for their families, and be good citizens. But when the family unit dissolved, they were treated as a liability to be managed by the state. This leads us to a dark and necessary part of our deep dive. When you combine the loss of social identity, the restriction of access to children, and the total financial liquidation of the individual, you create a perfect storm for a mental health crisis. James is sitting in his quiet, empty apartment in Denver, looking at a bank balance that is near zero, and wondering what he is working for. He is experiencing a level of isolation and despair that is statistically linked to the highest rates of self-harm in the country. In the next part, we are going to look at the silent epidemic of the divorced father's health. We will look at the shocking data on male suicide in the post-divorce years, and why the American social fabric is failing to catch these men before they fall. What happens when a man feels he is worth more to his family as an insurance policy than as a father? We are going to look at the raw, uncomfortable data of the midlife male crisis and the systemic reasons why no one is sounding the alarm. The sociological phenomenon of social death is perhaps the most harrowing aspect of the divorced father's journey in the United States. To understand this, we must look at how the American male identity is constructed. It is a scaffolding built upon three primary pillars: occupational success, the role of the husband protector, and the role of the paternal provider. When a divorce occurs, two of these pillars are instantaneously kicked out from under the individual. In the hypercompetitive landscape of 2026, where social standing is increasingly tied to visible family stability and professional output, the removal of the family unit leaves the man in a state of ontological insecurity. He is no longer who he was, and the society around him has no ready-made slot for who he has become. Imagine Thomas, a 48-year-old lead architect living in Seattle. Thomas spent 20 years building a reputation, a home, and a family. In 2026, following a high-conflict divorce, Thomas resides in a 700-square-foot studio apartment. His mornings, which once consisted of the chaotic but grounding ritual of packing school lunches and managing the household commute, are now defined by a crushing, sterile silence. This is the beginning of what sociologists call the erosion of the self. Thomas is experiencing the invisible man effect. In his suburban neighborhood, he was a fixture. Now, in his downtown rental, he is just another middle-aged man in an elevator. Historical trends indicate that this transition from a central social figure to a peripheral one is a primary driver of the male mental health crisis. Data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and various sociological surveys in 2026 reveal a staggering reality. The suicide rate for divorced men in the United States is roughly 8 to 10 times higher than that of divorced women. To analyze why this disparity exists, we must look at the concept of the social monitor. As we touched on earlier, a spouse often functions as the primary health and emotional gatekeeper. Without this monitor, a man like Thomas is significantly less likely to recognize the physiological symptoms of clinical depression. In the American male lexicon, depression rarely looks like sadness. It looks like irritability, social withdrawal, or an obsessive focus on work. This is what researchers call masked depression. Thomas does not tell his colleagues he is struggling. Instead, he takes on more projects, stays later at the office, and slowly detaches from the few friends he has left. Step by step, the psychological collapse follows a predictable sociological path. First comes the isolation. In 2026, male friendship networks in the United States are famously fragile. Most married men's social lives are managed by their wives. When the marriage ends, the father often discovers that he has no independent support system. He does not have a group of men he can call to discuss his emotional state. Second comes the ruminative cycle. Without the daily distractions of family life, Thomas spends his evenings replaying the legal battles and the moments of perceived failure. This leads to the third and most dangerous step, the calculation of utility. This is where we encounter the insurance policy phenomenon. It is a dark sociological truth that many divorced fathers in high-conflict situations begin to view their own existence through a purely transactional lens. Thomas looks at his financial ledger. He sees the child support, the alimony, the legal fees, and the cost of his own diminished lifestyle. He realizes that his life insurance policy, established during the marriage to protect the family, would effectively solve all the financial problems his divorce created. In this state of mind, the man concludes that he is worth more to his children as a payout than as a father who only sees them 4 days a month. This is not just a personal tragedy. It is a systemic outcome of a legal and financial framework that commodifies the father's role while restricting his emotional presence. The healthcare system in 2026 is often ill-equipped to handle this specific demographic. Most therapeutic models are based on face-to-face emotional processing, which historical trends show is less effective for many men than shoulder-to-shoulder activity. When Thomas tries to seek help, he often finds a clinical environment that feels foreign or even accusatory. Furthermore, the social stigma surrounding the divorced dad, the suspicion that he must have done something wrong to lose his family, prevents him from being honest about his despair. He fears that admitting to mental health struggles will be used against him in the ongoing custody litigation, a very real potential outcome in the adversarial American court system. This creates a lethal paradox. The men who most need support are the ones most incentivized to hide their pain. We must also consider the role of the 2026 digital landscape. For a man in Thomas's position, the internet can become a dangerous echo chamber. Isolated and looking for answers, many divorced fathers find themselves drawn into online communities that validate their anger, but offer no path to healing. These spaces often reinforce the idea that the system is an immovable monolith designed to destroy them. While these communities provide a temporary sense of belonging, they frequently exacerbate the social alienation by encouraging a permanent state of victimhood. The sociology of these digital spaces shows a trend toward radicalization and deeper despair, rather than the constructive rebuilding of a new identity. The loss of paternal authority also contributes to a sense of purposelessness. In American society, we often tell men that their value is found in being needed. When the court system and the new household structure signal to Thomas that he is not needed, that his role has been outsourced to a step-parent or simply replaced by a check, the fundamental reason for his labor disappears. This leads to a state of anomie, where the social norms that once guided his life no longer apply. He is working 70 hours a week to fund a life he does not get to witness. This lack of a feedback loop, the simple act of seeing your children grow and thrive because of your direct effort, is a psychological vacuum that few can survive indefinitely. Case studies from 2024 and 2025 highlight how the intersection of financial ruin and emotional isolation creates a physical health decline that mirrors the mental one. Divorced fathers show significantly higher rates of heart disease, hypertension, and substance abuse. Thomas might find himself drinking more to quiet the silence of his apartment, further complicating his ability to perform at work or show up as a present father during his visits. It is a downward spiral where each factor reinforces the other. The legal system demands he be a high-earning provider, but the psychological weight of the system makes it impossible for him to maintain the very performance the system requires. As we look at the data, we have to ask, why is there no national conversation about the survival of the American father? Why do we focus on the mechanics of the divorce but ignore the soul of the man going through it? The potential outcomes for a society that ignores the social death of its fathers are profound, impacting the next generation's view of family, commitment, and masculinity itself. But the story doesn't end with the individual's struggle. There is a broader cultural war being waged over the very concept of fatherhood in America. In the next part, we are going to dive into the media's role in shaping the image of the bumbling or dangerous divorced dad. We will examine how film, television, and advertising have spent decades preparing us to view the father as the optional parent, and how this cultural conditioning makes the legal and psychological struggles we have discussed almost inevitable. What happens when a man looks in the mirror and only sees the caricature society has created for him? The answer lies in the power of the narrative, and it is a narrative we are going to deconstruct in detail. The deconstruction begins with a look at the archetypes that define the American domestic landscape in 2026. When a man looks into the cultural mirror provided by film, television, and digital advertising, he frequently encounters two primary and equally damaging caricatures: the bumbling incompetent and the potential threat. These are not merely harmless tropes. They are sociological frameworks that dictate how the public, the legal system, and even his own children view his paternal value. Historical trends in American media show a distinct shift starting in the late 20th century. In the 1950s and 60s, the father was portrayed as the ultimate moral authority, the father knows best model. By the early 2000s, this was replaced by the Homer Simpson or Peter Griffin model, where the father is a well-meaning but fundamentally clueless secondary character who must be managed by a more competent, grounded mother. Imagine Kevin, a 40-year-old high school history teacher in Cincinnati, Ohio. In 2026, Kevin is 18 months into his post-divorce life. Kevin is a man who spent a decade helping raise his two daughters, changing diapers, managing bedtime routines, and cooking family meals. Yet, when Kevin sits down to watch a streaming service, he is bombarded with commercials for household products that show a father accidentally shrinking the laundry, or being unable to figure out how to pack a school lunch without a mother's intervention. For Kevin, this is a form of symbolic annihilation. Sociologists use this term to describe the absence or trivialization of a social group in the media. When the culture repeatedly tells Kevin that men are naturally inept at domestic labor, it creates a subtle, persistent pressure to step back and let the mother take over, even when he is perfectly capable. Step by step, this media conditioning influences the practicalities of the divorced father's life. Consider Kevin's interactions with his children's school. Despite being a teacher himself and being listed as an equal parent on the enrollment forms, the school's administration in 2026 still defaults to calling his ex-wife for every minor issue, from a forgotten permission slip to a slight fever. This is the institutionalization of the bumbling dad trope. The staff has been socially conditioned to believe that the father is the secondary parent, the one who is likely at work or simply too disconnected to handle a domestic emergency. Kevin finds himself constantly having to overperform just to be viewed as an equal stakeholder in his children's education. He has to be twice as organized and twice as communicative, just to reach the baseline level of respect that is automatically granted to the custodial mother. The second, darker caricature is the potential threat, or the unstable ex-husband. In 2026, American news media and crime procedurals often emphasize the narrative of the vengeful father. When a high-conflict divorce makes the news, the language used is frequently coded to suggest paternal volatility. We see terms like estranged father or non-custodial parent used as descriptors that carry a weight of suspicion. For a man in a legal battle, this narrative is a constant shadow. Potential outcomes for men like Kevin include a heightened sense of anxiety during public interactions with their children. If Kevin's daughter has a tantrum in a grocery store on his weekend, he feels a level of public scrutiny that a mother simply does not experience. He is acutely aware that as a single man with a child in a public space, he is being viewed through a lens of potential risk, rather than one of routine parenting. This cultural conditioning has a direct impact on the judicial system. Judges, attorneys, and court-appointed evaluators are not immune to the media they consume. If the prevailing social narrative suggests that fathers are either visitors who want to have fun or risks that need to be managed, the legal system will continue to produce outcomes that reflect these biases. Case studies from 2024 and 2025 indicate that even in gender-neutral jurisdictions, fathers are often subjected to more rigorous psychological evaluations than mothers. They are required to prove their fitness, whereas maternal fitness is often assumed. This is the sociological cost of the caricature. It creates a higher barrier to entry for the father to maintain a central role in his family. Furthermore, we must analyze the architecture of the weekend warrior. This is a media-driven image of the divorced father who only shows up for the highlights, the baseball games, the birthdays, the expensive vacations. This trope serves to delegitimize the father's role as a source of discipline and daily guidance. When the media portrays the divorced dad as the one who provides the fun while the mother provides the structure, it reinforces a binary that is destructive to the children's perception of their father. Kevin struggles with this daily. He wants to be the parent who helps with the difficult math homework and enforces the 8 p.m. bedtime, but he feels the cultural pull to be the Disneyland dad because he is terrified that if he isn't providing a high-stimulation environment, his children will prefer the stability of their mother's home. In the digital landscape of 2026, social media platforms like TikTok and Instagram have amplified these tropes. We see viral trends that mock dad fails or celebrate the girl mom culture, in a way that often leaves no space for the father's contribution. For a divorced father, scrolling through these feeds is a constant reminder of his outsider status. He sees a world that is curated for the nuclear family or the empowered single mother, but he sees very little content that reflects his reality. The quiet apartment, the meticulous planning of a 48-hour visit, and the deep, silent commitment to being a parent from the periphery. This lack of representation leads to what sociologists call role strain, where the expectations of the role are inconsistent with the individual's ability to perform them within the existing social structure. Imagine if we shifted the narrative. Imagine if the media reflected the reality of millions of American men who are fighting for more responsibility, not less. But as of 2026, the trend remains focused on the caricature. This internalization of the visitor role is a step-by-step psychological process. First, the father feels the sting of the stereotype. Second, he experiences the institutional bias that reflects that stereotype. Third, he begins to doubt his own necessity. This is the most dangerous stage. When a man like Kevin starts to believe that his children might actually be better off without the disruption of his 2-day visits, because the media and the school and the courts have told him he is just a helper, the bond is at its most fragile. We are looking at a society that has spent 50 years refining the image of the optional father. This has created a sociological climate where the removal of the father from the home is seen as a logistical hurdle, rather than a structural tragedy. The potential outcomes of this cultural conditioning are evident in the rising rates of paternal withdrawal. When the cost of fighting the narrative becomes higher than the man can afford, emotionally or financially, he may simply disappear into the caricature of the absent father, a role the society has already prepared for him. But what happens when these fathers stop being silent? What occurs when the individual struggle transforms into a collective movement? In the next part of our masterclass, we are going to explore the rise of the fatherhood advocacy movement in the United States. We will look at how men are utilizing the legal system to challenge the status quo, the data behind the move toward 50-50 custody as the new national default, and the intense sociological backlash this movement is facing from various sectors of society. We are moving from the individual experience to the political battlefield. Who are the people fighting to change the definition of the American dad? And why is this one of the most contentious debates in modern sociology? The answer will take us into the heart of the American courthouse and the future of the American family. To understand the shift from individual despair to collective political action, we must examine the landscape of American family law in 2026. We are currently witnessing the rise of the shared parenting movement, a sociological and political force that is fundamentally rewriting the social contract of fatherhood. For decades, the advocacy for divorced fathers was often sidelined as a fringe interest, but today, it has transformed into a sophisticated, data-driven lobby that is challenging the very foundations of the family court system. This movement is not merely about the rights of men. It is a push to change the legal default from a winner-take-all custody model to a rebuttable presumption of equal shared parenting. Imagine Jason, a 39-year-old HVAC technician in Tallahassee, Florida. In 2026, Jason finds himself at the center of a legal revolution. Florida, following the lead of states like Kentucky and West Virginia, passed landmark legislation that moved the starting line of custody battles to a 50-50 time-sharing split. Before this shift, a man in Jason's position would have entered the courtroom with the burden of proof. He would have had to prove why he deserved more than 4 days a month. Now, under the 2026 legal framework, the burden has shifted. It is now up to the party seeking to restrict time to provide clear and convincing evidence that equal time would be detrimental to the child. This is a monumental sociological shift that replaces the visitor role with the co-parent role as the state-sanctioned norm. Historical trends show that this movement gained momentum as the gender pay gap narrowed and more women entered the workforce as primary or equal earners. The argument presented by advocacy groups is a logical extension of gender equality. If society expects men and women to be equal in the professional sphere, it must allow them to be equal in the domestic sphere. For Jason, this means he is no longer viewed by the law as a secondary caregiver, whose primary utility is a child support check. Instead, the law recognizes his daily physical presence as essential. Step by step, the implementation of these laws involves a rigorous process where judges look at factors such as geographical proximity, the ability of parents to communicate, and the prior involvement of each parent. However, the rebuttable presumption means that the judge starts at 50-50 and only moves away from it if specific, documented risks are identified. However, this movement has not arrived without intense sociological backlash. There is a deep-seated tension between the concept of parental rights and the traditional best interests of the child standard. Opponents of the 50-50 default, including some bar associations and domestic violence advocacy groups, argue that a rigid presumption of equal time can be a dangerous tool in the hands of an abusive or controlling parent. They suggest that it prioritizes a father's right to his children over the actual safety and stability of the child's daily life. In 2026, the debate has reached a fever pitch. Case studies from states that have adopted these laws show that while litigation rates often drop, because there is less to fight for when the outcome is predetermined, there are still significant concerns regarding how the system handles high-conflict cases involving coercive control. For Jason, the shift in law has led to a potential outcome of increased cooperation, but it requires a new set of social skills. This is where we see the rise of the parenting coordinator. In 2026, many U.S. courts now mandate the use of these professionals to manage the minutiae of shared parenting. If Jason and his ex-wife cannot agree on a summer camp or a medical provider, they don't go back to a judge, they go to a coordinator. This professionalization of parenting is a direct result of the equal time movement. It acknowledges that while 50-50 is the goal, the sociological reality of two households operating in perfect tandem is incredibly difficult to achieve. It creates a new middle layer of bureaucracy, designed to keep fathers integrated without overloading the judicial system. We must also analyze the data regarding the outcomes for children under these new shared parenting models. Historical trends and studies from the early 2020s, which have been confirmed by more recent data in 2026, suggest that children in shared parenting arrangements generally show better academic performance, lower rates of substance abuse, and higher levels of emotional stability compared to those in sole custody arrangements. This data is the primary weapon used by fatherhood advocacy groups. They argue that the state has a compelling interest in ensuring that every child has a meaningful relationship with both parents, not just because it is fair to the adults, but because it produces better citizens. For a man like Jason, being able to participate in the Tuesday night bath routine and the Wednesday morning school drop-off is not a luxury. It is a protective factor for his children's future. The backlash, however, also touches on the economics of the legal profession. A move toward a 50-50 default effectively devalues the billable hours of family law attorneys. If the outcome of a custody case is largely decided by a legal presumption, there is less need for expensive expert witnesses, private investigators, and prolonged trials. This has led to a quiet but significant resistance from within the legal industry. Sociologically, this represents a conflict between an entrenched professional class and a grassroots movement of parents seeking to reclaim their roles. Jason's experience in the courtroom in 2026 is much faster and less adversarial than it would have been 5 years ago, but he still feels the friction of a system that is fundamentally designed for conflict. Furthermore, we are seeing a shift in how masculinity is performed within these advocacy groups. In the past, fathers' rights groups were often seen as angry or reactive. In 2026, the rhetoric has shifted toward the nurturant father. The focus is on the emotional bond, the importance of reading stories, and the necessity of being present for the mundane moments of childhood. This rebrand is a strategic move to align the movement with broader social values of gender equity and child welfare. By framing the issue as a children's rights issue, the right of a child to have their father, the movement has gained mainstream traction that it previously lacked. But as the legal walls begin to shift, a new and perhaps more complex challenge arises. Even when the law grants a father equal time, the social and psychological damage of the divorce process often lingers. We have to ask, once the legal battle is won, how does a man rebuild a home from the wreckage of a broken marriage? What happens to the internal world of the father when the courtroom doors close and the reality of 50-50 parenting begins? In the next part of our deep dive, we are going to look at the psychological reconstruction of the divorced dad. We will examine the data on post-traumatic growth, the rise of male-specific healing retreats, and the specific challenges of re-entering the dating world as a full-time 50-50 parent in 2026. The legal victory is only half the battle. The true work of being a father in the modern era begins in the quiet moments between the transitions. How does a man find peace when his family has been redesigned by a judge? We are going to look at the tools for survival in a post-litigation world. The transition from the adversarial environment of a United States courtroom to the domestic reality of 50-50 parenting in 2026 is often described by sociologists as a period of profound identity reconstruction. For years, the man has defined himself through conflict, through the lens of a litigant fighting for time. When the decree is signed and the schedule is set, he enters a vacuum. The fight is over, but the work of being a father in a fragmented household has just begun. We must examine the tools for psychological survival in this post-litigation world, starting with the concept of post-traumatic growth. Historical trends in psychology traditionally focused on the deficit model, the trauma of divorce and its potential outcomes for depression. However, current sociological research in 2026 highlights a different path. Men who utilize the crisis of divorce as a catalyst for a fundamental recalibration of their values and behaviors. Imagine Brian, a 44-year-old civil engineer in Phoenix, Arizona. Brian has just secured a week-on, week-off custody schedule. For the first time in his life, Brian is a solo parent for 7 consecutive days. In the sociological literature, this is known as the trial by fire. Brian quickly realizes that the home he shared with his ex-wife was structured around her routines and her social architecture. To survive and thrive, Brian must undergo a step-by-step reconstruction of his domestic sphere. This starts with the physical environment. Brian moves away from the transitional living model, the half-unpacked boxes and the spare room that feels like a hotel, and begins the process of nesting. Sociologists suggest that for a father to reclaim his authority, his home must reflect his own values and presence. This isn't just about furniture. It is about creating new rituals that are unique to the dad's house. Whether it is a specific Friday night movie tradition or a unique way of handling the morning school run, these rituals act as the glue that reattaches the paternal bond in a post-nuclear setting. However, the most significant challenge Brian faces is the transition paradox. This is the emotional whiplash that occurs every Sunday evening during the handoff. One minute, the house is vibrating with the noise and chaos of 2 children. The next, it is a tomb of silence. Data from 2026 indicates that the first 48 hours after the children return to the other parent are the highest risk period for social withdrawal and depressive episodes in divorced fathers. To combat this, we are seeing a rise in male-specific healing initiatives across the United States. Unlike traditional talk therapy, which many men find restrictive, these 2026 models favor shoulder-to-shoulder support. We see the growth of father-focused hiking groups, community woodworking circles, and volunteer cohorts where the conversation about life and loss happens as a byproduct of shared activity. This is the sociological answer to the loneliness epidemic, rebuilding a tribe of men who understand the specific rhythm of the 50-50 life. Step by step, Brian must also navigate the treacherous waters of the 2026 dating landscape. For the divorced father, dating is no longer a simple search for companionship. It is a complex negotiation of social roles. Historical trends show that men are more likely to repartner quickly after a divorce than women, often seeking to fill the domestic and emotional void left by their previous marriage. However, the potential outcomes of rushing this process can be catastrophic for the paternal bond. Sociologists observe that the introduction of a new partner within the first year of a 50-50 arrangement often triggers a regression in the children's adjustment. Brian finds himself in a digital dating market that categorizes him as a package deal. He must balance his desire for a new life with his primary responsibility as a solo parent every other week. This creates a fragmented dating life where Brian exists as two different men: the available bachelor on his off weeks and the dedicated, unavailable father on his on weeks. This compartmentalization is a hallmark of the modern American divorced dad experience. We must also analyze the shift in Brian's professional identity. In 2026, the concept of the 50-50 father is forcing a change in corporate America. Brian can no longer stay late every Tuesday or attend last-minute out-of-state conferences when it is his week with the children. This leads to a sociological phenomenon known as the fatherhood penalty, similar to the motherhood penalty that has affected women for decades. Brian's career trajectory may slow as he prioritizes his domestic responsibilities. Case studies from 2025 and 2026 show that men who successfully navigate this transition often report higher levels of life satisfaction, despite a lower rate of professional advancement. They are trading the traditional provider status for a more holistic, present version of masculinity. This is a radical departure from the mid-20th century American model, and it is creating a new class of men who are as comfortable in the kitchen as they are in the boardroom. The psychological reconstruction also requires a confrontation with the social stigma of the failed family. Even with a 50-50 split, Brian often encounters the subtle judgment of his community. At the pediatrician's office or the grocery store, there remains a lingering cultural suspicion of the man alone with children. Brian must develop a high degree of emotional intelligence to navigate these interactions without internalizing the shame. This is where the post-traumatic growth is most evident. By standing in the gap and performing the labor of parenting without a partner, Brian is dismantling the caricature of the bumbling dad. He is proving to himself and to society that his paternal capacity is not dependent on a marriage contract. He is becoming what sociologists call an autonomous father, a man whose identity is grounded in his direct relationship with his children, rather than his status as a husband. Consider the financial discipline required in this new world. We discussed the child support trap earlier, but for the 50-50 father, the economics are even more complex. Brian is likely paying some form of support while also maintaining a full household. In 2026, the rise of the micro-budgeting movement among divorced dads is a testament to the resilience of this demographic. These men are becoming experts in resource management, finding ways to provide a rich life for their children on a fraction of their former disposable income. This economic pressure often leads to a more minimalist, intentional lifestyle, which further contributes to the psychological shift away from the consumer-driven provider model. As Brian moves deeper into his second year of solo parenting, the potential outcomes start to manifest in the children. We see the development of the binuclear family bond. The children begin to appreciate the different strengths and environments each parent provides. Brian realizes that he doesn't have to be everything. He just has to be a consistent, stable presence. This is the goal of the post-litigation reconstruction, to move from the survival of the crisis to the mastery of the new reality. It is a journey from being a man who lost his family to being a man who has built a new, resilient version of home. But even as the personal reconstruction takes hold, a larger question looms over the American landscape. What does the rise of millions of men like Brian mean for the future of the United States? As this generation of divorced dads raises a new generation of children, how will the very concept of gender, family, and social stability change? In our final part, we are going to look at the macro-sociological impact of the divorced father. We will examine the long-term data on the children of the 50-50 revolution, the projected shifts in American housing and urban planning to accommodate the two-home child, and the ultimate legacy of the men who refuse to be visitors. We are moving from the individual story to the final conclusion of our masterclass. What is the endgame for the sociology of the American father? The final chapter will reveal a future that is already arriving. The endgame for the sociology of the American father is not found in the restoration of the 1950s nuclear model, but in the institutionalization of the binuclear network. As we reach the conclusion of this masterclass in 2026, we are witnessing the birth of a new social infrastructure, designed to support a society where the family unit is no longer defined by a single roof, but by a shared purpose across multiple nodes. This is the macro-sociological shift that will define the middle of the 21st century. To understand the scale of this change, we must look at how the physical and economic landscape of the United States is currently being redesigned to accommodate the millions of children who now live in two primary homes. Imagine Chris, a 24-year-old architecture student in Chicago. Chris is part of the first generation to reach adulthood under the wide-scale implementation of 50-50 shared parenting laws. For Chris, the concept of a broken home is a sociological relic. He grew up seeing his father not as a weekend visitor, but as a fully competent, autonomous domestic leader. This has fundamentally altered Chris's view of masculinity and domesticity. He enters the workforce and the dating market with a blueprint for fatherhood that is based on presence and labor, rather than just resource provision. This is the generational echo of the 50-50 revolution. The potential outcomes of this shift include a massive reduction in the gender competency gap. When a generation of boys grows up watching their fathers manage kitchens, laundry, and medical appointments with the same authority they bring to their professional lives, the bumbling dad caricature finally loses its cultural power. Step by step, this generational shift is impacting American urban planning and real estate. In 2026, we are seeing the rise of the proximity radius. For decades, the primary driver of suburban sprawl was the single-family home. Now, a new historical trend is emerging: the demand for dual primary residences within the same school district. Developers in cities like Austin, Charlotte, and Denver are now designing multifamily units and townhome complexes specifically marketed toward co-parents. These are residences that feature dual primary suites or adaptable bedroom configurations that allow for the ebb and flow of children on a 50-50 schedule. The sociology of the neighborhood is shifting from a collection of isolated nuclear units to a web of interconnected households. This geographic clustering is necessary for the functional success of shared parenting, as it minimizes the transition friction for the children and allows both parents to remain active in the same community organizations, sports leagues, and school boards. Data from the 2025 and 2026 housing reports highlight that the most valuable commodity for the modern divorced father is time, and time is a function of geography. Men are increasingly willing to sacrifice square footage for proximity to the custodial hub. This is driving a revitalization of the mid-tier urban apartment market, where fathers can maintain a professional life and a paternal life within a 10-minute radius. This spatial reorganization is the physical manifestation of the legitimacy the fatherhood movement fought for in the courtrooms. It is no longer enough to have a right to see the children. The father must have the infrastructure to actually parent them. We must also analyze the long-term economic impact of this binuclear model. Historically, divorce was viewed as an economic catastrophe that led to the liquidation of male wealth. However, in 2026, we are seeing a trend toward the preservation of social capital. While the costs of maintaining two households remain high, the increased involvement of fathers is leading to better educational and professional outcomes for their children. This is a form of long-term wealth preservation. Case studies of families in 50-50 arrangements show that children are more likely to pursue higher education and maintain stable employment when they have consistent, high-quality access to both parents' networks and resources. The state, recognizing this, is slowly beginning to adjust tax incentives to reflect the reality of the two-home child, though the legal system still lags behind the sociological reality. The final sociological synthesis of the divorced dad is the emergence of the integrated patriarch. This is a man who has successfully navigated the identity liquidation of divorce and reconstructed himself as an independent, nurturant, and financially responsible leader. He is no longer defined by his relationship with a wife, but by his immutable bond with his children. This represents the ultimate deconstruction of the paterfamilias. In the old model, the father's authority was delegated through the marriage. In the 2026 model, the father's authority is direct and self-earned. This shift is creating a more resilient version of American masculinity, one that is less dependent on external validation and more grounded in the daily reality of caregiving. Furthermore, the American workplace is being forced to reckon with this new reality, as more men in high-level positions demand the flexibility to meet their 50-50 parenting obligations. The stigma surrounding the family-first man is evaporating. We are seeing the implementation of parental parity policies that go beyond maternity leave to include flexible scheduling for all parents, regardless of gender or marital status. This is the corporate endgame of the sociology we've discussed. When the most productive members of the workforce are also 50-50 fathers, the system has no choice but to adapt. The potential outcomes include a more balanced, less burnout-prone professional culture that values efficiency over performative over time. However, we must remain vigilant about the potential for a new class divide in fatherhood. The data in 2026 shows a widening gap between men who can afford the legal, geographic, and professional costs of the 50-50 life, and those who cannot. In lower-income communities, the barriers to shared parenting, lack of affordable housing near the mother, rigid work schedules, and the high cost of legal representation continue to push men toward the peripheral visitor role. The next phase of the sociological movement will likely focus on closing this gap, ensuring that the right to be a present father is not a luxury afforded only to the upper middle class. As we conclude this deep dive, we return to the individual. We think of Marcus, David, Robert, and the millions of others who have walked the tightrope without a net. Their struggle was the labor that produced the new American family. They are the pioneers of a post-nuclear society that is finally beginning to value the father as more than an insurance policy or a weekend guest. The sociology of the divorced dad in America is a story of transformation, from a figure of loss to a figure of essential daily presence. The future of the American family is not in the absence of the father, but in his total, undeniable integration into the new binuclear normal. This is the end of our 10-part masterclass, but the conversation is only beginning. The data we have explored today is the foundation for the next decade of social policy and cultural change. As we move forward, the question is no longer whether fathers should be equal, but how we can continue to build the world that allows that equality to thrive. The history of the American family is still being written, and for the first time in over a century, the father is holding the pen with both hands. This transition marks the end of an era of isolation, and the beginning of an era of paternal legitimacy that will echo through the generations to come.